If you haven't heard of Glasswing or Mythos, you will. Glasswing is an effort by Anthropic and the Tier 1 software companies to protect themselves from the dangers of AI capabilities doubling every 7 months. Don't expect this new AI defense initiative to cover physical asset operators. Welcome to the Enduring Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Zachary Alexander. This podcast is for physical asset operators who are setting the stage for what comes next. The giant software companies operate from a tiered engagement framework. The Tier 1 covers their biggest customers, the clients who command the majority of their attention, their roadmaps, and their resources. But even Tier 1 companies have a ceiling. The only thing that trumps a mega customer is self-preservation. Glasswing is what self-preservation looks like when AI capabilities doubling is dangerous to them. You might be asking, why does this matter? You're not a software company, and the AI revolution hasn't reached your doorstep. You're proud to be a physical asset operator, and nothing gets done until something physical shows up. However, we might be on the verge of a Y2K level event. For context, Y2K, short for year 2000, was a widespread software crisis rooted in a decades-old coding shortcut that threatened to cause global computer failures at the stroke of midnight on January 1st, 2000. The fear was simple and catastrophic. When the clock struck midnight, computers worldwide would misread 00 as the year 1900. Triggering cascading failures across banks, power grids, hospitals, and government systems. Because nearly every critical infrastructure system relies on date-dependent software, even a small error could ripple into global economic and operational collapse. Companies had years to plan. CEOs lost sleep, boards had endless meetings, and hired consultants to help them navigate it. And yet the majority of the work was done in the final year. That's when public awareness reached a fever pitch. Now we're talking about a similarly catastrophic threat, this time from Anthropic's new next-generation model Mythos. Mythos has crossed the capability threshold where it can surpass all but the most skilled humans at finding and exploiting software vulnerabilities. Even ones that have survived decades of human review and millions of automated tests without ever being caught. However, there is no discussion about when physical asset operators will get the same level of protection as software companies for their assets. Y2K mattered precisely because it threatened physical assets, hospital ventilators, nuclear plant controllers, flight systems, power grids. The same can be said about the threat posed by Mythos. But here's where the two diverge. Y2K had a known deadline. Mythos has a proliferation clock nobody can read. In past episodes, we've talked about the MCP metadata architecture. It is slated to be the bridge that connects the physical asset world to LLMs. It is the architectural answer to the physical layer gap enjoyed by software for LLM access. We will come back to that later, though. For right now, that bridge is not built and the proliferation clock is not engaged. Let's talk about what's actually at stake when a physical asset operation gets hit. When a software company gets compromised, the damage is real but contained. Data gets stolen, systems go offline, recovery is expensive and embarrassing. But the consequences live inside a screen, and the optics can be managed. Any news of a breach can be withheld for a more suitable time. Physical asset operators don't have that luxury. When their systems get hit, the consequences are on full display for the world to see. A compromised SCADA system doesn't lose data. It runs a machine outside of safe parameters and eventually melts down. A hijacked fleet dispatch doesn't lose files, it stops trucks. A corrupted maintenance system doesn't corrupt records, equipment halts that never was flagged for service. This is not a software problem with physical symptoms. It's a physical problem with software origins. And that distinction matters because the recovery path is completely different. A software company restores from backups. A physical asset operator, on the other hand, may have to replace equipment, rebuild supply chains, and explain to customers why their orders didn't ship or were short. The blast radius is different in kind, not just degree. It's much more visible. You can't issue a quiet patch and move on. The damage shows up on the floor, in the field, on the balance sheet, simultaneously. That's not in the scope for Glasswing, and there is no initiative in place to gather defenders. Let's be clear about who Glasswing was built for and who it wasn't. Glasswing's coalition reads like a who's who of the technology world: Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Cisco, Palo Alto Networks, CrowdStrike. These are organizations with dedicated security teams, incident response capability, and the internal expertise to act on what Mythos previews. They were already the best defended companies in the world. Glasswing makes them better. Today, roughly 55 to 70% of middle market companies are physical asset dependent. That means nothing gets done until something physical shows up. The disruptions brought on by the AI revolutions don't impact until now. They have existed outside the boundaries that the Tier 1 software companies have chosen to address. Physical asset operators run on the same operating systems that Glasswing projects do. Outside of that, they operate in a software landscape that doesn't even show up on the Tier 1 software company radar. They exist in an undefended buffer zone. A buffer zone is a kill zone. Nothing survives there for long. That's not a footnote. That's an engineering gap. And nobody in the Glasswing coalition is losing sleep over it because it was never identified as their problem to solve. The MCP metadata architecture is the bridge that connects the physical asset world to LLMs. It is the architectural answer to the physical layer gap. We will come back to that later, however. Let's spend a little more time talking about what's in the Glasswing buffer zone. The roughly 200,000 U.S. middle market businesses collectively generate 1/3 of private sector GDP. They employ between 44.5 and 48 million people. If the U.S. middle market were its own country, it would rank as the 5th largest economy in the world, larger than the GDP of Germany and Japan. This is sitting in the buffer zone. These are not passive companies waiting for innovation to reach them. They innovate close to their core, fast and precise, without centralized R&D labs or armies of researchers. They pull innovation because they have to. They don't have the luxury of waiting. But here is the fragility hiding inside that strength. When cost pressures intensify, and a cyber attack on a physical asset operation is the definition of cost pressure, 53% of middle market leaders say they would reduce R&D and innovation investment. That is the exact wrong response at the exact wrong time. The AI revolution won't wait. The proliferation clock doesn't slow down because of your budget. The threat doesn't pause because you cut the innovation line. The Glasswing buffer zone doesn't just contain the backbone of the U.S. economy. It contains the innovation capacity that keeps that backbone competitive. And it'll be the first thing that gets cut when the attack lands. These are the companies that have no defenders and live in a buffer zone. So what's different about this crisis? Y2K and Mythos look similar on the surface. Same physical infrastructure at risk, same late mobilization pattern, same dependence on vendors to patch system operators don't control. But one thing makes the crisis categorically different from Y2K. Y2K had a clock everyone could read. Midnight, December 31st, 1999. The date was the organizing principle for every boardroom, every consultant engagement, every government initiative. You knew exactly how much time you had. You could plan around it. You could hire around it. You could build a budget around it. The deadline was the mobilization. Mythos has a proliferation clock that nobody can read. There is no date. There is no countdown. We don't even know when it will officially be released. There's only the rate of AI capability advancement, which Anthropic itself has said will be substantial over the next few months. And the window between when defenders have access and when adversaries have access is closing in the very near future. Y2K gave organizers years to prepare, and most of the work still got done in the final year. Mythos gives physical asset operators no such luxury. There is no final year, no months to prepare. There is no date to organize around. There is only the moment when a dangerous capability is released to the wrong hands. And by then, the window is already closed, and everybody is on the clock. That is what makes this crisis different. Not the threat, not critical infrastructure at risk, not even the scale of the potential damage, the clock, and the fact that nobody can read it. Here's what happens next. Physical operators recognize the threat after the fact, after initial breaches. They do what they have always done. They call enterprise vendors and land in the queue if they are lucky. If not, they search for resources and kindred spirits in the product-branded communities. The CMMS provider, the ERP company, the Tier 1 software incumbent who has been selling them systems for years isn't inclined to pick up the phone because their top customers are in distress. Next, the name on the contract is familiar. The sales rep knows their operation. The demo looks impressive, and the pitch sounds exactly like what they need. It isn't. The Tier 1 software vendors still build everything on structured data. What's in the database? What's in the work order? What's in the maintenance log? That data is real and it has value, but it's not where the physical asset vulnerability lives. The physical asset vulnerability doesn't live in the minds of executives at Tier 1 software companies. It lives in the gaps between systems, in the machine behavior that never made it into the CMMS, computerized maintenance management system, in the workaround the senior technicians have been running for years, more years than they care to remember. And yet, nobody took the time to document. It's the vendor relationship that exists because one of the company's operator made a phone call that nobody in management even knows happened. The Tier 1 software vendor cannot see that layer, not because their technology is inadequate, but because their executives have never had to get their hands dirty. Most don't understand sweat equity unless they were founders. The challenge is that most of them are concerned about the wonders of learning how to fly planes. Small, single-engine aircraft have put an end to more companies than anyone will ever say out loud. Simply put, Tier 1 software vendors built their systems for the data that exists in their databases. The physical asset vulnerabilities live in data that was never captured. That is a Tier 1 trap. You call the most credible software vendor you know, you get a solution built for a problem they understand, rather than the problem you actually have when Mythos gets released. And your problem will compound as the software proliferates. Here's something else nobody is talking about. Y2K didn't just consume attention, it consumed growth capital. Some estimates put the total Y2K remediation spending at somewhere between $300 and $600 billion globally. Capital, in most cases, came directly from technology and innovation budgets. Innovation pipelines froze, technology roadmaps got shelved, companies that were on the verge of meaningful tech advances spent that money on 1999 patch code instead of building the future. The threat was real, the response was necessary, and the opportunity cost was enormous. Mythos carries the same risk for the AI revolution. We never know what's going to knock a tech revolution off the rails. It just always does. And adoption slows before the second phase kicks in earnest. Y2K is proof of that. And right now, Mythos is the most visible candidate for doing exactly that to the AI revolution. One diverted budget at a time. The companies that recognize the threat will divert budget toward remediation, patching the software that Mythos identifies as vulnerable. That is the rational response to a visible threat. And it's not enough for physical asset operators that need actual defense. The architecture that's needed to defend LLMs enable physical assets is the MCP metadata architecture. That is the infrastructure that creates a compounding defense advantage and yields enduring advantage well into the future. By capturing decision traces from long-term workers before they walk out the door, instrumenting the operational environment, and making every future defensive capability more effective than when it arrives. The skeptics among us will say LLMs don't have access to IIoT or industrial Internet of Things. They can't reason without context on edge servers. Agents and LLMs can't connect to the hubs where physical asset intelligence actually lives. The sensor networks, the PLCs or programmable logic controllers, the SCADA systems, the condition monitoring equipment. The MCP metadata architecture that we've been talking about on this podcast is the bridge that closes that gap. It's where decision traces from these interactions are turned into institutional knowledge, which arguably is the most important resource the physical asset operators have. If the budget goes to remediation instead of architecture, that bridge never gets built. And many of the currently viable physical asset operators will not survive. The software gets patched while the physical assets will be exposed. And the proliferation clock keeps running against an operation that spent its capital defending someone else's priority. Y2K froze the innovation pipeline of the early 2000s. Mythos will freeze the architecture builds of the late 2020s. The threat is real, the response is necessary, the opportunity cost will be devastating. Having said that, here's the drone maker posture on the situation. Every beat of this episode has shown why Glasswing and the MCP metadata architecture could be prioritized as competing priorities. Two claims on the same budget, two arguments for the same capital, someone else's priority. The budget diversion trap pulls your capital toward the wrong layer, and the proliferation clock keeps running while you decide. However, what if they are not competing priorities at all? Glasswing identifies software vulnerabilities, and the coalition will execute their mission well. However, fixing software vulnerabilities is only valuable if it compounds. A patched vulnerability that gets forgotten is a single-use fix. A patch vulnerability that gets captured as a decision trait is enriched, classified, linked, and becomes institutional knowledge. It becomes a part of the advantage layer. It becomes the kind of knowledge that makes defending against the next threat faster, cheaper, and more precise. The MCP metadata architecture is the layer that makes that compounding possible. Build it correctly, and Glasswing's vulnerability intelligence could strengthen your architecture investment. The vulnerability scans become knowledge input that can be packaged and sold as an AI native service plan. We're calling them paid skills. If you look close, you can see the origins of paid skills in the growing adoption of Claude skills. The combination of the remediation decision becomes a decision trace, plus any patches become the paid skill. That then becomes a compounding asset rather than a one-time fix that disappears into a closed ticket. Right now, LLMs don't have access to IoT devices. That's the Industrial Internet of Things. Edge servers are the hubs where physical asset knowledge actually lives. The MCP metadata architecture is the bridge that closes that gap. And Glasswing's intelligence is exactly the kind of external signal that should be flowing across the bridge into your advantage layer. You don't have to choose between patching the software and building physical asset defenses. You can build one architecture that does both. Glasswing joins an adaptive network generating intelligence. The MCP metadata architecture becomes a compounding mechanism that turns the Glasswing intelligence into enduring advantage. Every dollar spent on remediation compounds in the architecture rather than disappearing into a single-use, one-time fix. That's not a compromise. That's a drone maker posture applied to the physical asset operator's problem. As a middle market physical asset operator, you don't need to fight someone else's platform war. You can stay on mission and protect what survives the AI revolution. Physical asset operators have been in the buffer zone for the entire AI revolution. No coalition, no defenders, no plan. Glasswing just made that gap impossible to ignore. And it handed you the intelligence that justifies the MCP metadata architecture. That proliferation clock is running. The bridge is not yet built. The drone maker posture doesn't wait for the bridge to be built by someone else. It builds the bridge. Two birds, one architecture.